Betty White had one rule about the Golden Girls. She never watched herself. For someone who brought so much laughter to millions, it might seem strange that she avoided rewatching her own work. But there was one scene in particular that haunted her, not because it was bad, but because of what it reminded her of. In interviews toward the end of her life, Betty confessed there was a moment from the show that she simply couldn't bear to revisit, not because of her performance, not because of the writing, but because of what was happening off camera when the cameras rolled. The scene in question comes from a later season of The Golden Girls. Rose, Betty's character, delivers one of her usual quirky, rambling stories from her childhood in St. Olaf, a small-town fairy tale that the audience had come to love. She nails the delivery. The studio audience laughs. But what viewers might not have noticed is how B. Arthur, playing Dorothy, sits there stone-faced, both in character and possibly in real life. There's no witty comeback, no eye roll, just silence. For fans, it was just another beat in the show's offbeat rhythm. For Betty, it was something else. She said the moment felt like she was being shut down, asterisk for a real star. Not just Rose being dismissed, but Betty herself being ignored. And she felt it deeply. That coldness in the room, the lack of reaction, wasn't just scripted, it was personal. Betty later admitted that watching that clip brought back a wave of discomfort she didn't want to relive. It wasn't just about the silence, it was what the silence meant. At the time, Betty chalked it up to a bad day on set. But over time, she realized there was a pattern, one she couldn't unsee. The way Dorothy looked at Rose wasn't just acting. It mirrored something darker happening behind the scenes. That clip became symbolic for her, a reminder how lonely it sometimes felt to be the one who always smiled, even when others weren't smiling back. That's what made the scene hurt. What's even more striking is that Betty White was known for being endlessly optimistic, the life of the room, the cast member who kept things light. For someone like her to admit that a single moment from her most beloved work caused her emotional pain, it says a lot. It's the kind of vulnerability most stars never share. But Betty did, because even legends have limits. And for her, that moment was a quiet line she never wanted to cross again. She could remember every detail. The studio lighting, the energy of the crowd, even a faint sound to be signed before the next line. It was burned into her memory. And no matter how many awards the show won, or how beloved Rose Nylund became, that one scene stayed with her, not as a failure, but as a truth no one else could see. What most fans never saw beneath the cheerful surface of the Golden Girls was a quiet, simmering tension, one that Betty White carried for decades. While the show's four iconic actresses delivered flawless chemistry on screen, the reality behind the cameras was far more complicated. And the most infamous rift, it was between Betty White and B. Arthur. For years, whispers about their feud floated around Hollywood, but Betty always kept things classy. Still, after B.A.'s passing and with the benefit of distance, stories began to surface, and they painted a very different picture of what life was like on set. According to multiple producers and insiders, B. Arthur simply did not like Betty, and it went deeper than artistic differences. It got personal. One of the show's producers, Marsha Posner Williams, gave an interview that shocked longtime fans. She recalled overhearing B call Betty the C word. Not once, but several times. Not in the heat of an argument, not as a joke, but as a genuine expression of disdain. It wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was something more venomous. And yet, Betty never publicly retaliated. She stayed smiling, charming, and in true Betty fashion, took the high road every single time. But even the high road can be a lonely one. The contrast between their personalities was part of the problem. Betty was light, bubbly, always eager to engage with fans and the studio audience. B, on the other hand, was more reserved, more cerebral. Some said she thought Betty's warmth was fake, too performative. Others said she just couldn't relate to someone so perpetually upbeat. Rue McClanahan once revealed that he resented how Betty won awards and was the darling of the press, Wabi herself felt overlooked. It wasn't just the press, either. Betty had come into the Golden Girls with a long television legacy behind her. She was already America's sweetheart from the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and her comedic timing made her a favorite with live audiences. B, a Broadway-trained actress, valued timing and discipline, but didn't warm easily to Betty's crowd-pleasing energy. That difference created an invisible line on set, one that everyone walked around carefully. But the real twist? None of this ever leaked while the show was running. The professionalism on screen was so solid, the chemistry so believable, that no one suspected anything. They laughed, they hugged, they bickered in character, and every bit of it felt real, because in some ways it was the passive aggression, the snide remarks, the long silences. They weren't written. They were woven into the fabric of their real-life tension. And yet, Betty never lost her composure. Even when she knew she was being disliked behind the scenes, she showed up with grace. She never exposed B, never threw shade in interviews, never let it bleed into her work. But deep down, she carried it. And that quiet feud became one of the most mysterious and unspoken undercurrents in sitcom history. The tension between Betty White and B. Arthur wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was something that left a deeper bruise on Betty than most people ever realized. Because for Betty, the hurt didn't come from sharp words or cold shoulders. It came from why those things happened, and that's what truly stung. Betty had always been the cheerful one. Whether on camera or off, she radiated kindness. People often assumed it came easily to her, that being America's grandma was just her natural state. But what they didn't see was the effort it took to keep that positivity going, especially in an environment where it wasn't always welcomed. Betty once said in an interview, "I always try to be upbeat, but sometimes that made people think I wasn't serious." And that's exactly where the problem with B began. B. Arthur was serious, deeply talented, fiercely intelligent, and incredibly private. B approached acting with discipline. She wasn't interested in pleasing the crowd between takes. She wasn't there to chit-chat with the audience. She wanted to deliver a performance and go home. Betty, by contrast, thrived on engagement. She would often talk to the studio audience, joke with the crew, and bring a light energy to the room. It was her way of keeping the mood lifted, especially during long, exhausting shooting days. But to B, it felt like showboating. Like Betty was playing to the crowd for attention. Instead of focusing on the scene, that subtle disapproval grew over time, and Betty felt it. Sometimes in a silence, sometimes in a stare, sometimes in a way a compliment when ignored. It wasn't overt bullying. It was something colder, a withdrawal, a dismissal. What made it worse was that Betty looked up to B. She respected her talent immensely. In fact, she once called BA's comedic instincts genius level. So when that admiration was met with resentment, it cut deep. Betty wasn't just dealing with a co-star who didn't like her. She was dealing with rejection from someone she wanted to be close with, and for someone as emotionally open as Betty, that was devastating. It also made the show harder to perform. Imagine walking onto a set where every laugh you get feels like a problem for someone standing next to you. Imagine nailing a scene, only to feel like your own castmate sees it as a threat. Betty felt that pressure often. She once joked, "You can't win them all," referring to the cast dynamics, but her eyes told a different story. It wasn't a joke. It was a wound she covered with humor. And yet, Betty never let it show in her work. That's the most remarkable part. She played Rose Nyland with such warmth and sincerity. You'd never guess she was doing under a cloud of tension. But behind that iconic smile was a woman who felt misunderstood, even in the role that made her a legend. And it's that quiet pain, not the public praise, that stayed with her the longest. For years, the drama behind the Golden Girls remained Hollywood's best-kept secret. Fans saw four women laughing, bonding, and living under one roof, and they believed it. That was the magic of the show. It felt real. So when whispers of off-screen tension finally started to surface, it was almost too much for fans to accept. How could such lovable characters hide something so cold behind the scenes? The first real cracks in the perfect image came not during the show's original run, but years later, long after the lights had dimmed and the cast had gone their separate ways. In interviews from the 2000s, Betty White began to hint at what had really been going on. She never named names directly at first, but the tone said enough. And when asked point-blank about her relationships with the cast, her words were always carefully chosen. About Rue McClanahan, she was warm and affectionate. About Estelle Getty, she was protective and proud. But when B. Arthur's name came up, there was always a pause, a softness that felt almost like sadness. Eventually, Betty admitted that B just didn't like her. She said it calmly, without bitterness, like someone who had come to terms with something they couldn't change. She found me a pain in the neck sometimes, Betty said in one interview, flashing that signature smile. But behind the smile was a truth that couldn't be softened. B had resented her, not for anything Betty had done, but for who she was. BEA's son, Matthew Sachs, would later confirm it. In an unexpected move, he spoke publicly after his mother's death, acknowledging the tension between Betty and B. He said his mother was complicated, brilliant, strong-willed, and not always easy to get along with. My mom had a harder edge, he said. She wasn't the type to throw her arms around people. That's just who she was. He didn't excuse her behavior, but he helped the public understand it. And in doing so, he confirmed what Betty had tiptoed around for years. What followed was a wave of reactions online. Fans were shocked. The internet lit up with debates. Was B the villain? Was Betty playing innocent? But as more interviews emerged, especially Rue McClanahan's memoirs, the picture became clearer. B could be harsh. Betty could be too cheerful for her liking. And Rue, she was the one who tried to keep the peace. It wasn't a scandal. It was just real life. Still, the public image of the Golden Girls would never be quite the same. Suddenly, those cozy kitchen conversations didn't feel so innocent. Fans began to rewatch old episodes, analyzing every look, every pause, every subtle cue between B and Betty. Were they acting, or was there something real underneath? What made it all even more heartbreaking was that by the time the truth surfaced, it was too late for reconciliation. B had passed away in 2009, never having made peace with Betty. And Betty, though gracious as ever, carried that unresolved tension for the rest of her life. Betty White was America's sweetheart, always smiling, always charming, always the one who could make a room full of strangers feel like old friends. But behind the twinkle in her eye and the perfectly timed jokes, there was a truth Betty rarely talked about. Fame could be incredibly lonely, and in Betty's case, that loneliness didn't come from the public. It came from the people closest to her, those she worked with, those who stood beside her under the spotlight. By the time the Golden Girls premiered, Betty was already a household name. She had decades of television under her belt, Emmy wins, and an adoring fan base. But with that success came isolation. Not every co-star embraced her. Not every friend could handle her light. Some saw her endless cheer as insincere. Others assumed her kindness was a performance. And eventually, even Betty started to wonder if the very thing that made people love her was the same thing that made her feel misunderstood. It wasn't just B. Arthur. Betty had faced this kind of quiet rejection before. In earlier parts of her career, she was often underestimated because of her looks and demeanor. People didn't realize that behind the sweet smile was a woman with razor-sharp instincts and business savvy. She wasn't just a funny actress. She was a trailblazer, one of the first women to produce her own sitcom, Asterisk Life with Elizabeth Asterisk in the 1950s. But still, she found herself boxed in, too bubbly to be taken seriously, too kind to be seen as strong. And when the spotlight dims, that's when the silence grows loud. Betty admitted in later interviews that coming home after a live show could feel like landing in a vacuum. The cheers would stop, the laughter would fade, and she'd sit alone with her thoughts. Fame had given her a platform, but it had also taken something in return. the comfort being truly understood. Everyone loved Betty White, but very few knew her. One of the hardest parts came after the Golden Girls ended. The cast drifted apart, and Betty's relationship with the others never fully healed. Even though fans begged for reunions and spin-offs, the spark behind the scenes was gone. Betty kept busy, guest roles, game shows, public appearances, but the heart of that golden era was over, and with it, a quiet sorrow set in. She once said that losing the girls felt like watching a family break apart slowly, one goodbye at a time. The irony was cruel. Betty was celebrated more in her 80s and 90s than ever before. She became a cultural icon, beloved by multiple generations. She had millions of fans, yet no one to call after a long day who truly understood what Golden Girls had meant to her, or what it cost her emotionally. That kind of fame, that level of admiration, can be a cage lined with gold. It looks beautiful from the outside, but on the inside, it's still a cage. As Betty White entered her final years, she became something even greater than a television icon. She became a symbol, of joy, of resilience, of grace under pressure. But beneath the glowing headlines and endless admiration, Betty carried a truth that never quite made the tabloids. Even the brightest stars can carry shadows. And for her, one shadow lingered longer than the rest. The tension from the Golden Girls, and the way it quietly haunted her long after the cameras stopped rolling. When asked in a late interview if she had any regrets from her career, Betty gave a rare moment of honesty. "I wish I had been able to understand people better," she said softly. "I think sometimes I made it too easy for people to misread me." It wasn't a confession of guilt. It was something deeper, a recognition that not every wound is visible and not every grudge is loud. Some simply settle into silence and stay there unresolved. The most heartbreaking part? Betty always hoped for reconciliation. Friends close to her said she kept a photo of the Golden Girls cast in her living room. Even after B. Arthur passed, Betty never spoke ill of her. In fact, she praised BEA's talent until the very end. "She was brilliant," Betty once said, "and I never stopped admiring her." That quiet admiration, despite everything, was Betty's final word on their complicated bond. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need closure. She just needed peace. And in a way, she got it, not through apologies or heart-to-hearts, but through time. As the years passed and fans continued to revisit the Golden Girls, something remarkable happened. The love for Betty didn't just grow. It deepened. People saw past the bubbly persona and began to understand the strength it took to be that consistent, that kind, in an industry that often rewards the opposite. They began to appreciate not just her comedy, but her quiet endurance. There's a certain kind of pain that comes from being the peacemaker, the one who never claps back, never exposes, never breaks character. Betty knew that pain well, but she also believed in something larger than herself, the power of grace. And in her final reflections, that's what she chose to hold on to. Not the hurt, not the feuds, not the what-ifs, just the memories, the laughter, the impact. When Betty White passed just days before her 100th birthday, the world mourned as though they'd lost a grandmother. But what many didn't know is that she had already been saying goodbye, quietly, through interviews, through gentle stories, through that same glowing smile. And if there was one message she left behind, it wasn't just about humor. It was about forgiveness, about choosing warmth over bitterness, even when it wasn't returned. Because in the end, Betty's greatest legacy wasn't Rose Nyland. It was how she lived, with heart, with grace, and with a secret that never turned her cold. A secret she carried with dignity until the very end. Betty White didn't just leave behind a legendary career. She left behind a lesson, one that wasn't about acting, fame, or even comedy. It was about how to move through the world with grace, even when things aren't fair, even when the people closest to you don't see you the way the world does. The story she carried from the Golden Girls wasn't one of bitterness. It was one of quiet heartbreak, a reminder that not all wounds are loud, and not all friendships are perfect. But what made Betty so unforgettable wasn't just her smile or her humor. It was her ability to keep going, to keep loving, even when it hurt. She never aired dirty laundry, never took the easy route of revenge or drama. Instead, she let her work speak for her. And what it said, loud and clear, was that kindness takes strength, that joy is a choice, and that sometimes the people who seem the happiest are the ones who had to overcome the most. Betty White revealed something rare, that behind every laugh there's a story. And sometimes the most beautiful ones are also the most painful. She carried hers with dignity. And in doing so, she reminded us what it really means to live well,